Dakota Territory, 1887. While his neighbors raced to throw up single-wall cabins before winter, Norwegian immigrant Anders was still building in late September. They called his walls wasteful. They called him a fool. 2 houses for 1 man, they laughed, watching him nail together double-plank skins with a 6-inch cavity between them. He hand-tamped sawdust and moss into that gap, added paper and battens inside, cut his windows small at 18 by 24 inches, and built a vestibule like an airlock at his door. 22 pounds of cut nails for what others finished with 12. 16 days of work for what they completed in 8. Then January 12th, 1888 arrived. The children's blizzard hit without warning, temperatures plunging from warm morning to deadly cold by noon, winds ripping visibility to mere yards. That night, Anders banked his small stove at 6 and let it die. His neighbor's single-wall cabin fell from 56 degrees to 32 degrees in 2 hours. But Anders's thin walls? They held at 58 degrees at 8 o'clock, 50 degrees at midnight, still 46 degrees at dawn. No refire needed. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand about stopping wind and pinning air that turned his neighbor's mockery into desperate copying by spring? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The pre-dawn cold of December 1887 bit through the thin walls of Thomas Collins' cabin like wolves through paper. At 5:30, Anders Hansen rose in the darkness next door, struck a match, and fed 3 split logs into his small box stove. The flue damper clicked shut at 6 o'clock sharp, a sound Collins had learned to recognize through the frosted window that separated their claims by barely 60 yards. Collins kept his own fire roaring until noon, burning through nearly half a cord of oak in a week, yet by evening his thermometer rarely climbed above 40 degrees. At 6 that evening, Collins let his fire die and wrapped himself in 2 wool blankets, waiting for the familiar plunge toward freezing that came with every Dakota night. He'd hung quilts across his interior walls like a second skin, stuffed rags into every chink he could find, and still woke most mornings to ice in his water bucket. Through his window, he could see the dim glow from Anders's place, that strange double-walled contraption the Norwegian had spent 14 days building while sensible men finished their cabins in 8. By midnight, Collins's wall thermometer read 34 degrees. He pulled on his boots and coat, grabbed a lantern, and trudged through the snow to Anders's door. The vestibule, that 6 by 7 foot airlock the fool had insisted on building, kept the wind from blasting into the main room when Anders answered his knock. Inside, the wall thermometer showed 58 degrees. No fire had burned for 6 hours. Anders poured coffee from a pot that sat warm on the stove's cooling iron. "The walls hold what the fire gives," he said in his careful English, gesturing toward the strange construction that had drawn so much ridicule. What Collins saw looked like madness disguised as carpentry. 2 complete walls, each made of 1-inch planks, stood 6 inches apart around the entire 16 by 20 foot perimeter. Between them, Anders had hand-tamped a mixture of sawdust and dried moss, roughly 85 parts sawdust to 15 parts moss by volume, creating what he called dead air pinned by fiber. The technique had cost him 22 pounds of cut nails instead of the 12 pounds any sensible builder used. The extra planks, paper, and battens had added $8 to his material costs, money that Collins and the other neighbors had declared wasted. "Why build 2 houses when one will do?" they'd asked each other, watching Anders nail up his inner skin of planks over paper, then batten every seam at 12-inch intervals. But the numbers that December night told a different story. Anders's cabin held heat, like the ice houses Collins remembered from his Ohio boyhood, the same sawdust-filled structures that kept ice solid through August heat. The principle worked in reverse during Dakota winter. The sawdust fiber structure trapped air in thousands of tiny pockets, stopping the convective loops that made simple air gaps worthless. The double plank skins created 2 pressure boundaries, cutting the wind pumping that drove heat loss through every chink and gap in standard construction. Anders had positioned his windows small, 18 by 24 inches each with double sash, and faced his door east to dodge the northwest gales that hammered the territory from November through March. 60 feet upwind, he'd built a zigzag snow fence from scrap lumber and brush, parking the worst drifts away from his threshold. Every detail served the same purpose, stopping wind before it could steal heat. The mockery had started in September, when Anders continued building while his neighbors finished chinkling their single-wall log cabins. Thomas Collins, as road overseer and part owner of the local sawmill, had led the criticism. "That Norwegian's building 2 houses for 1 fool," he'd announced at the general store, drawing laughter from the other homesteaders. They watched Anders tamp sawdust into his wall cavity with a wooden pestle, achieving a density of 4 to 5 pounds per cubic foot, tedious work that required constant checking for settlement and retopping every few weeks. The technique drew skepticism from men who trusted thick logs and big iron stoves to solve cold. Collins had built his cabin from 8-inch logs with clay and straw chinking, believing that mass and fire were the frontier's answer to winter. His windows were large for light, his door opened directly into his main room, and he'd scorned Anders's suggestions about drift control and air sealing. Dead air walls sounded like patent medicine nonsense to men who measured cabin strength by log diameter. But Anders had learned his trade in the ice crews of Minnesota and Wisconsin, where sawdust-filled partitions kept 100-pound blocks solid through summer. He'd seen how stopping air movement mattered more than thickness alone, how wind could strip heat through the smallest gaps, how Norwegian farmers had used double walls and vestibules for generations. His wall system wasn't theory, it was proven practice adapted to Dakota conditions. The settling had happened exactly as Anders predicted. After 2 weeks, the sawdust compacted enough to require topping off, but the moss content prevented the complete settlement that left gaps in pure sawdust fills. The paper backing and interior battens stopped drafts that would have rendered the insulation worthless. By November, the system worked like a thermos bottle made of wood. Heat went in, but couldn't escape. Collins burned through a quarter cord of wood each day that December, maintaining barely livable temperatures. Anders used less than 1/8 of a cord, achieving comfort that made his neighbors' suffering obvious. The $6 investment in extra materials was paying back in saved fuel within the first severe month. Yet the mockery continued, driven by pride and the frontier's suspicion of anything that looked complicated. The real test would come with January's blizzards, when Dakota winter showed its true face, and thin walls would either prove their worth or fail like every other homesteader's dream of staying warm. For now, Anders simply smiled at the criticism and kept tamping sawdust, trusting icehouse wisdom over frontier pride. The morning after Thomas Collins's midnight visit, Anders stood in his cabin with a cup of coffee, watching frost form patterns on his neighbor's windows, while his own glass remained clear. The difference wasn't magic. It was physics that icehouse operators had understood for decades, but frontier builders had never applied to human shelter. The sawdust between his double walls didn't just fill space. It created thousands of tiny air pockets that destroyed the convective currents responsible for heat loss in conventional construction. Most homesteaders believed that trapping air between walls would provide insulation, but they misunderstood how air behaved when confined. In a simple gap between 2 boards, air heated on one side would rise, cool against the outer wall, then sink back down, creating a continuous loop that actually moved heat faster than solid wood. The sawdust changed everything. Each wood fiber acted like a tiny barrier, pinning air molecules in place and preventing the circulation that made empty cavities worthless. The result was an insulation value of approximately 1 2/10 R per inch, modest by later standards, but revolutionary on the 1880s frontier. Anders had calculated the thermal resistance of his complete wall system during the long evenings of construction. The 6-inch sawdust cavity provided roughly 7 R units of insulation. Each 1-inch plank skin added another R unit to R unit and 2/10, depending on the wood species. Combined with the tight seams created by his paper backing and batten system, the complete assembly achieved an effective resistance of 9 to 10 R units, more than 5 times better than the single-wall log construction his neighbors trusted. But insulation meant nothing without air sealing, a lesson Anders had learned the hard way during his first Dakota winter in a rented cabin that leaked like a sieve. Wind pressure against the exterior wall of a building created a pumping action that drove outside air through every gap and crack, while the heated interior air escaped through corresponding openings on the opposite side. A single gap, the width of a pencil, running the full height of a wall, could waste as much heat as leaving a window open 6 inches. The paper barrier behind Anders's interior battens served as his primary air seal, backed up by careful caulking of every joint and seam. He'd learned to test for leaks by holding a candle near suspect areas on windy days, watching for the telltale flicker that revealed escaping heat. The double wall construction gave him 2 chances to stop air infiltration. The outer skin broke the wind's force, while the inner assembly provided the final thermal barrier. His neighbors' single-wall cabins failed because they fought only half the battle. Thomas Collins had chinked his logs with clay and straw, creating a reasonably tight shell, but he'd cut large windows for light and built no vestibule to control air loss when opening his door. Martha Kelsey had felt around her door frames and hung blankets as interior liners, but she'd left gaps between the blankets that allowed convective loops to strip heat from her interior air. Samuel Pike's cabin leaked so badly that snow drifted inside during blizzards, yet he continued adding firewood instead of addressing the fundamental problem. The thermal performance difference became obvious to anyone willing to measure it. Anders kept a careful log of his fuel consumption, recording each armload of split wood and noting the outdoor temperature when he fired his stove. His daily wood use averaged 0.12 of a cord during December's cold snaps, small morning and evening fires that brought the interior temperature to 65 degrees, then allowed the wall's thermal mass to coast through the day and most of the night. Collins burned nearly 3 times as much wood for worse results, stoking his larger stove every few hours to maintain 50 degrees in his main room. The difference wasn't stove efficiency or wood quality, it was heat retention. Anders's walls held warmth like a thermos bottle, while Collins's cabin shed heat as fast as his fire could produce it. The extra fuel cost alone would have paid for Anders's additional construction materials within 6 weeks. The moisture management built into Anders's wall system prevented the condensation problems that plagued many early insulation attempts. The sawdust fiber structure absorbed small amounts of water vapor without losing its insulating properties, while the moss content provided additional moisture buffering. The interior paper vapor barrier, combined with careful ventilation around his small stove, prevented the interior humidity from reaching the cold outer wall where it would condense and freeze. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. It was practical wisdom born from watching ice preservation in commercial operations across the upper Midwest. The same principles that kept ice solid under sawdust insulation in summer warehouses worked in reverse to keep heat inside wooden walls during prairie winters. Dead air pinned by fiber, multiple barriers to air movement, and moisture management that prevented thermal bridging through wet materials. The system worked because it addressed the real mechanisms of heat loss rather than fighting symptoms with bigger fires. Conduction through solid materials, convection through air movement, and infiltration through gaps. Anders's double wall assembly controlled all 3 with techniques that required skill and patience, but no exotic materials. Every component came from standard frontier resources: dimensional lumber, cut nails, sawdust from local mills, moss from nearby creek bottoms, and paper from supply catalogs. By late December, the performance advantage had become impossible to ignore. Anders woke to 50-degree mornings without lighting a fire, while his neighbors scraped ice from their interior walls. His small windows admitted enough light for indoor work, while their larger openings became sources of painful cold drafts. His vestibule allowed entry and exit without losing room heat, while their direct opening doors created temperature swings that made comfortable heating impossible. The mechanism was proven, measurable, and repeatable. What remained was the test that would either validate Anders's methods or expose them as elaborate failure when Dakota winter unleashed its full fury on the territory. January 12, 1888, dawned with temperatures near 40 degrees, warm enough for children to walk to school without heavy coats, warm enough for Anders to open his vestibule door and feel spring in the air. By 10 o'clock that morning, the barometric pressure began dropping with the speed that old-timers recognized as nature's warning of something terrible approaching from the northwest. Miss Eliza Hart dismissed her pupils early from the one-room schoolhouse, but not early enough. The temperature plummeted 30 degrees in 30 minutes, and the wind rose from gentle breeze to howling gale as a wall of Arctic air swept across the Dakota Territory like the blade of a scythe. What became known as the Children's Blizzard struck with violence that caught the entire territory unprepared. Visibility dropped to arm's length as snow drove horizontally across the prairie, and the temperature continued falling throughout the afternoon until thermometers registered 20 below zero with winds that made the air feel like 60 below. Across Nebraska, Dakota Territory, and Minnesota, 235 people would die in the next 18 hours, many of them children caught between school and home, lost in the whiteout that turned familiar landscapes into trackless wastes of snow and wind. Anders had been splitting wood behind his cabin when the first blast of cold air hit. He recognized the signs immediately: the sudden pressure drop, the strange yellow color of the sky, the way his breath began steaming in air that had been comfortable moments before. He gathered an armload of split oak and hurried inside, securing his door and checking the damper on his stove. His thermometer read 58 degrees at noon. By 2 o'clock, with the wind shrieking around his cabin like a living thing, he lit his fire and settled in to wait out what he knew would be a killer storm. His logbook, kept with the precision of a man who understood that measurements meant survival, recorded the cabin's performance through the crisis. At 6 o'clock that evening, with the storm at its worst and his stove radiating steady heat, the interior temperature reached 62 degrees. Anders banked the coals, adjusted the damper to hold fire through the night, then made his final entry before settling into his bunk. Outside, the wind hammered his double walls with sustained fury, but inside the cabin felt solid and warm as a root cellar. Thomas Collins, meanwhile, fought a losing battle against the cold. His single-wall cabin shuddered under each gust of wind, and despite keeping his larger stove red hot, his thermometer never climbed above 56 degrees. Every opening of his door to bring in more wood sent a blast of Arctic air through the main room that dropped the temperature 5 degrees and took 20 minutes to recover. By evening, he'd burned through nearly a full cord of wood and still couldn't achieve the warmth that Anders maintained with a fraction of the fuel. At 8 o'clock, Anders recorded 58 degrees with no fire burning, his banked coals providing just enough heat to maintain the thermal equilibrium his walls had achieved. Collins, still stoking his stove every hour, watched his thermometer fall to 48 degrees and wondered how he would survive the night. Martha Kelsey, in her felt-lined cabin 2 claims over, had hung additional quilts as interior walls and still recorded 36 degrees with a roaring fire. The storm was testing every construction method on the frontier, and the results were becoming clear with each hourly temperature reading. At midnight, with the blizzard howling unabated and the temperature outside approaching 30 below zero, Anders noted 49 degrees in his logbook. His fire had been dead for 6 hours, but his double walls continued holding heat, like the ice houses that had taught him the principles he was proving. The sawdust between his walls had created a thermal barrier that the storm couldn't penetrate, while his neighbors' single-wall construction surrendered heat as fast as their stoves could produce it. The real test came when desperate knocking at his vestibule door woke Anders at 2 in the morning. Miss Eliza Hart stood in the airlock with 2 of her pupils, 8-year-old Sarah Levinson and 10-year-old James Pike, all 3 of them blue with cold and exhausted from fighting through the storm. The children had become lost trying to reach home from the schoolhouse and had wandered for hours in the whiteout before spotting the faint glow from Anders's windows. The vestibule, that 6-by-7-foot chamber his neighbors had mocked as wasteful, now served its true purpose, allowing entry without dumping the main room's precious heat. Hart's own thermometer, kept in the teacherage built with standard frontier construction, had fallen to 28 degrees despite a fire that consumed wood faster than she could split it. The school board had provided a single-wall frame building with large windows for light and no thought for thermal performance. She'd wrapped herself and the children in every blanket she owned, but the building leaked heat so badly that ice formed on the interior walls within 3 feet of the stove. Anders fed his rescued guests hot coffee and soup, while his thermometer held steady at 47 degrees, warmer than most heated buildings in the territory that night. The children fell asleep in genuine comfort while the storm continued raging outside, and Hart marveled at the stable temperature that required no tending of the fire. She'd never experienced such warmth during a Dakota blizzard, and she understood that she was witnessing something that challenged every assumption about frontier construction. By 6 o'clock the next morning, with the storm finally beginning to weaken, Anders recorded 46 degrees, a total drop of just 16 degrees through 12 hours without fire during the worst blizzard in territorial history. Collins, who had burned wood continuously through the night, woke to 32 degrees and ice in his water bucket. The difference wasn't luck or better wood or superior stove design. It was the thermal performance of walls that worked like insulation instead of like sieves, walls that proved their worth when the stakes were measured in human lives rather than comfort and convenience. The morning after the children's blizzard, Martha Kelsey stood in her kitchen with a pencil and ledger book, calculating numbers that would either validate or condemn every construction choice made on the Dakota frontier. Her thermometer readings through the storm told a story that challenged 40 years of American building wisdom. At 6 o'clock the previous evening, with fires blazing in cabins across 3 townships, temperatures had varied by only 10 degrees from house to house. By 8 o'clock, with Anders's fire already banked and others still burning hot, the spread had widened to 18 degrees. At midnight, the gap reached 22 degrees, and by dawn it was 26 degrees, the difference between sleeping in comfort and waking to ice in the water bucket. The performance contrast wasn't subtle or debatable. Anders's double-wall construction had retained usable heat for 12 full hours after his fire died, while standard single-wall cabins became uninhabitable within 2 hours of losing their fires. Martha's own cabin, improved with felt linings and draft stopping, fell somewhere between the extremes but closer to failure than success. Her careful records showed interior temperatures dropping from 54 degrees at fire out to 34 degrees within 3 hours, then continuing the slide toward freezing despite her best efforts at heat retention. Thomas Collins had experienced the most dramatic failure. His 8-inch log walls, chinked with clay and straw according to standard frontier practice, had surrendered heat so rapidly that he'd been forced to maintain fire throughout the night or face the real possibility of freezing in his own bed. Even with continuous burning, his cabin never achieved the stable warmth that Anders enjoyed with banked coals. The thermal mass of thick logs, which frontier wisdom claimed would store and release heat gradually, proved worthless without air sealing to prevent wind-driven heat loss. The fuel consumption numbers revealed the economic reality behind the performance gap. Martha's ledger showed Anders burning approximately 12 hundredths of a cord per day during January's severe weather, while maintaining interior temperatures that allowed normal household activities. Collins consumed 25 hundredths of a cord daily for barely livable conditions. Samuel Pike, whose cabin leaked so badly that candles flickered in the drafts, burned 30 hundredths of a cord each day and still recorded interior temperatures below 40 degrees on the worst nights. The mathematics were unforgiving. At current wood prices of $1.75 per cord delivered and split, Collins spent over $10 more than Anders each month just to achieve inferior heating. Pike's fuel costs exceeded Anders by nearly $15 monthly, money that represented weeks of wages for men working railroad construction or harvest crews. The $8 premium Anders had paid for double-wall construction materials was recouped in less than 3 weeks of severe weather operation. But the numbers revealed more than economics. They exposed the physical principles that determined success or failure in frontier shelter. Anders's sawdust-filled cavity created thermal resistance. Through thousands of trapped air pockets, each one prevented from circulating by the fiber structure that pinned molecules in place. The result was measurable, approximately 7 R units of insulation where standard construction provided less than 2 R units. Combined with his air sealing techniques, the complete wall assembly achieved thermal performance that was genuinely revolutionary for its time and place. The air infiltration control proved equally crucial. Martha had discovered this through careful observation with candles and strips of paper held near suspected leak points. Her single-wall construction, despite careful chinking, allowed wind pressure to drive cold air through gaps no wider than knife blades. The pumping effect created by differential pressure across the walls meant that heated interior air was constantly being exchanged with frigid outdoor air, a process that defeated insulation and overwhelmed heating capacity no matter how large the fire. Anders's double wall system interrupted this process at multiple points. The outer plank skin broke the wind's direct assault, reducing pressure differentials across the thermal barrier. The sawdust cavity eliminated convective currents that would have moved heat from the inner to outer surfaces. The interior paper and batten system provided the final air seal, creating what amounted to a wooden thermos bottle around the living space. Each component served a specific function in the thermal control system, and removing any element would have compromised the whole. The small window strategy had proven equally important. Anders's 18 by 24-inch double-sash windows provided adequate light while minimizing heat loss through glazing that conducted cold directly into the interior. His neighbor's larger windows, cut for maximum illumination, created thermal weak points that no amount of fire could overcome. Glass conducted heat 20 times faster than his insulated walls, making every oversized window a liability during severe weather. The vestibule effect had saved lives during the storm while demonstrating another crucial principle. Each time Collins opened his door to bring in wood or check his animals, a blast of Arctic air entered his cabin and dropped the interior temperature by several degrees. Recovery required 20 to 30 minutes of active heating, representing a massive energy loss repeated 8 to 12 times per day. Anders's airlock system allowed entry and exit with minimal thermal penalty, maintaining the stable interior environment that his wall system had created. Miss Eliza Hart's experience provided objective validation from someone with no stake in the construction methods debate. Her careful temperature records, maintained as part of her school reports, showed interior conditions that would have been impossible to endure for extended periods. The teacherage, built according to territorial standard specifications, had performed exactly as poorly as the thermal principles predicted. Only the shelter provided by Anders's superior construction had prevented what could have been a tragic outcome for her and the two children caught in the storm. The snow fence, positioned 70 feet upwind according to Red Willow's counsel, had controlled drift patterns that allowed normal access to the cabin throughout the blizzard. Collins and Pike had awakened to doors blocked by snow that required hours of digging to clear. Martha's entrance, partially protected by natural terrain features, remained accessible but difficult. Anders's door opened easily because the strategically placed windbreak had parked the major drifts exactly where his calculations had predicted they would form. These weren't accidents or lucky guesses. They were the predictable results of applied knowledge that combined Norwegian building traditions, American icehouse techniques, and Dakota environmental wisdom. The storm had provided the controlled experiment that proved which methods worked and which failed when survival depended on thermal performance rather than appearance or construction speed. The first thaw came in late March, and with it, the quiet procession of neighbors to Anders's door. Not for coffee this time, but for measurements. Thomas Collins arrived on a Tuesday morning carrying a pine stick marked with pencil notches, the frontier carpenter's method of recording dimensions without arithmetic. He wanted the exact spacing between Anders's wall studs, the precise depth of the sawdust cavity, and the batten layout that had sealed the interior so effectively. The mockery of September had become the desperate copying of spring. Collins ran his story stick along Anders's exterior wall, marking the 16-inch stud spacing that had provided adequate support for the double plank construction. He measured the 6-inch cavity depth with careful precision, noting how the sawdust had settled to exactly the density Anders had achieved through hand tamping. The interior batten spacing, 12 inches on center, went onto the stick, along with the 2-inch overlap pattern Anders had used for his paper air barrier. Every detail that had drawn ridicule 6 months earlier now became essential knowledge for men facing another Dakota winter. The retrofit work began immediately. Collins hired 2 men to help him add an inner plank liner to his existing log walls, creating the cavity that would hold sawdust insulation. The work was more complex than new construction because the existing structure had to remain weatherproof while the interior was rebuilt. They hung the new inner wall on a light frame attached to the log structure, leaving exactly 6 inches for the insulation cavity that Anders had proven necessary for thermal performance. Martha Kelsey chose a different approach, hiring Jens Reich to build a complete interior shell inside her frame cabin. Reich had become the county's expert on what he advertised as ice house walls for dwellings, having measured Anders's construction methods and adapted them for retrofit applications. His crew could transform a standard frontier cabin into a thermally efficient shelter in less than 2 weeks, charging $45 for materials and labor, expensive by territorial standards, but economical compared to the fuel savings the work would provide. The sawdust procurement became a community effort. Local sawmills found themselves with a new market for what had previously been waste material. Pike contracted for 12 cubic yards of sawdust at 50 cents per yard, enough to fill his cabin's retrofit cavity with material left over for spring top-off after settling. The mills began advertising insulation-grade sawdust, screened to remove large chips and bark pieces that could create thermal bridges through the insulation layer. Reich's operation expanded rapidly as word spread through adjoining townships. His workshop produced pre-cut battens, standardized paper sheets, and even prefabricated vestibule kits that could be added to existing doorways. His accounts showed 23 retrofit jobs completed between April and September 1888, with fuel consumption reductions averaging 40 to 55% in the first winter after installation. The testimonials were specific and measurable. Collins reported cutting his wood use from 9 cords to 4 cords per month during severe weather, while Pike's consumption dropped from over 10 cords to 5 cords monthly. The school board took official notice after reviewing Miss Hart's report on the teacherage's performance during the January blizzard. Sarah Levinson, now serving as a board member, used her merchant background to analyze the fuel costs and maintenance requirements of different construction methods. The numbers supported immediate action. New teacher housing would feature double-wall construction with sawdust insulation, small double-sash windows, and mandatory vestibules. The specifications called for 20 pounds of cut nails per structure, interior paper with 2-inch overlaps, and batten spacing at 12 inches on center, Anders's exact methods codified into institutional policy. The technique spread beyond individual cabins to commercial and institutional construction. The territorial capital considered double-wall insulation for its new territorial prison, where heating costs consumed a significant portion of the operation's budget. Railroad section houses, previously notorious for cold conditions that affected worker health and performance, began incorporating sawdust insulation in new construction. Even churches adopted the methods, discovering that comfortable interior temperatures encouraged better attendance during winter services. Anders found himself an unwilling consultant, visited by builders from 3 counties seeking advice on cavity construction, air sealing techniques, and drift control. He provided the information freely, understanding that thermal efficiency benefited entire communities during severe weather events. His original techniques evolved as other builders contributed improvements, better moisture barriers, more efficient tamping methods, and standardized component sizes that reduce construction time and material waste. The economic impact extended beyond individual fuel savings. Local sawmills invested in better screening equipment to produce consistent insulation material. Hardware stores stocked specialized items like story sticks marked for standard cavity depths and pre-cut paper sheets sized for common wall heights. A cottage industry developed around retrofit services, employing carpenters and laborers who had previously left the territory during winter months for lack of construction work. County records from 1889 show the measurable results of widespread adoption. Reported deaths from exposure during winter storms dropped by 60% compared to the previous 5-year average. Fuel consumption in improved cabins averaged less than half the wood use of standard construction, freeing up household resources for other necessities. The improved comfort levels allowed frontier families to pursue winter activities, reading, handicrafts, and education that had been impossible in poorly heated shelters. The vindication was complete when the territorial governor's annual report cited improved building techniques as a factor in successful settlement retention. Families who might have abandoned their claims after experiencing a typical Dakota winter stayed through subsequent severe weather because their homes had become genuinely livable. The population stability contributed to economic development, school establishment, and the social infrastructure that transformed frontier territory into organized communities. Anders' Fool's Cabin had become the model for thermal efficiency across the northern plains, proving that traditional knowledge, properly applied, could solve problems that conventional frontier wisdom had accepted as unavoidable. Build to stop the wind first. Thickness was secondary. The cold couldn't steal heat it couldn't reach.